Next, I'd like to welcome Matthew Cumbie, conservation preparator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, speaking about the crown of the Andes mound. Come on up, Matthew.
Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a mount I created for a pretty extravagantly decorated crown called the Crown of the Andes. The Crown of the Andes was acquired by the Met in the early summer of 2015, and I think the crown has a very interesting history that I think has been very well presented in this short film created for its debut at the Met. I'll show it to you now so you get a sense of the object. Oh. Didn't play? Oh, okay. All right, well, I'll start without it. It's all right. When the crown arrived at the Met, it was in really poor structural condition, and it was apparent even before it was acquired that the centuries of ceremonial use and decades of exhibition and reckless rental abuse, as shown here, the crown was actually rented out for parties and presented on tables, really strange. But it had started to take its toll on the thin golden arches, and it was so bad that the crown was so unstable that even the slightest movement made its arches jiggle like jello. So a temporary mount had to be constructed by my colleague Warren Bennett, just so it could safely be transported within the museum. Once in the Met's collection, our curator Rhonda Call's priority was to have Linda Borsch, the object's conservator, reduce the deformations in the arches and restore it to as close as possible to its original shape, similar to what's shown in this photo from the 30s. My job was to create a permanent mount support for safe handling and exhibition. Linda and I began to work closely together to determine the best way that this could be achieved. Each of the arches contained multiple breaks, which had been repaired in different ways over the centuries, the most fragile of which was this back arch, which had a horizontal break with 3 small brass tab repairs, 2 of which had cracked and were providing no support. This left only 1 small riveted tab holding that arch together at the upper bend. Other breaks had been repaired with silver solder, which created much stiffer areas, which made getting the arches back into shape much more difficult. The upper arches were individually hinged to the top section up here. Oops, sorry. There's the hinges. They were hinged to that top section, which supports the ball and cross at the top. Though at this point they really didn't offer much support. Each of the arches were attached to the bottom half of the crown with these threaded golden rods and golden nuts. Luckily, this meant that the arches could easily be removed from the bottom half, called the diadem, and worked on separately. Once they had been separated, Linda used padded pliers to reduce the deformations in the arches as much as she considered safe, and checked her progress against a template that she had made of the best-looking arch. She then repaired the cracks using conservation epoxy stiffened with carbon fibers laid across the tiny little joins. It was no small task, and I'm really in awe of how she was able to bring it back to its original beautiful shape. Once the shape of the arches had been reestablished, we began discussing how to design a mount system that would not only support the arches, but also travel with the crown if it ever needed to be moved, It would also need to be as discreet as possible since the interior of the crown would be visible while on display. I wanted to minimize obscuring any of the really delicate piercings in the gold work, which really made it so dramatic. Due to the mushroom-shaped nature of the crown, I decided that installing the mount by fishing the arms in through the bottom opening of the crown and attaching from below would be impractical. It would either require someone to hold the crown up for you while you worked on it, or require the construction of a custom platform to hold the crown high enough to fish the mount in from below. While the construction of a platform would have been possible, it would also require that the platform be stored indefinitely, along with documentation on how to install and deinstall the crown using the platform. No one knows when the crown will need to be removed from its mount, so I thought it was best to create one mount that didn't need a special support system for assembly and disassembly, and it could be fairly well understood just by looking at it. Because of this, I decided that the mount should be made up of 4 collapsible arms that could be fed in through the top of the crown and attached to a base plate. When I began to design the 4 arms, I knew how they connected at the top would be really important. The connection point needed to be able to support the weight of the arches, ball, and cross, and would be the key for guaranteeing the stability of the whole piece. Luckily, the inside of the crown has an undecorated circle beneath where the ball and cross rest, right there. This presented the perfect shape for creating a large enough attachment point. But the question was how to attach the 4 arms to each other in a secure and efficient way. My main concern was that the weight of the ball and the cross would create pressure on the arms, and this would force them inwards in on each other and cause the arms to torque out of alignment. Screwing the arms to the center attachment point seemed like a possibility. However, each arm would have required 2 screws each in order to provide enough support. And trying to fish 8 tiny screws, 8 tiny number 2 screws in through the underside of the crown amongst all the hanging emeralds seemed like an impossibly fiddly task. Also, the way the crown would be displayed, viewers would be looking up into the crown to see the dangling emeralds, so having 8 visible screw heads would not be ideal. Instead, I developed a disc system. Each arm would have a thin disc soldered to the end. These discs could meet and stack at the top of the crown. These discs would be roughly a quarter of the thickness of each of the arms and would be attached to the mount at staggering intervals. Staggering the point of attachment of each of the discs to its respective arm meant that once the 4 arms met at the top of the crown, each disc would be locked in place by the 3 overlapping arms. The inward pressure caused by the weight of the arches would press each disc forward against the overlapping arm directly across from it, keeping them in place. In order to prevent the arms from torquing, I locked the discs in place by soldering a pin off-center on the first disc. This pin then fitted in corresponding holes in the 3 discs below, locking them at 90 degrees to each other. And the end result, when they met at the top and were stacked together in the proper order, was that the 4 discs would appear at a glance to be one solid disc that was the same thickness as the arms. Once the arms were securely locked in place, it was time to secure the mount to the crown itself. Luckily, the crown provided its own simple solution. This large main emerald in the middle section of the crown's interior was attached to a loop that was soldered onto a handmade modern nut. This nut was screwed onto a handmade silver threaded rod that passed through the golden ball and had been soldered to the bottom of a small modern mount. And this mount held the cross. The curator was unhappy with how this modern mount obscured the bottom of the cross here, and asked the conservator if she could create a new mount. Linda created this really beautiful, discrete mount. Basically, this whole section in through here is new. It's a brass piece that she initially carved out of wax and had cast in brass, and then filed it to perfectly fit the cross, and then it gets, I believe it was attached with glue somehow, reversible glue, but it was a huge improvement over the original mount. We decided to salvage the threaded rod that was attached to the old mount, and I soldered that threaded rod onto this really delicate new mount that Linda made. We were then able to pass the screw through the ball and the arches and into the corresponding holes in the disc system, and then attach it with the nut with the dangling emerald attached to it, which basically makes the beautiful cross on the top of the crown the world's most elaborate and expensive number 6 machine screw and emerald nut. With the stability of the arms taken care of, my next concern was finding a way to navigate the mount through the many hanging emeralds while still remaining supportive and unobtrusive. There were a few ways I could address this problem. One possibility was to run the mount along the side of the emeralds, like this. However, I was concerned that this might create an unequal balance to one side of the mount, which could cause the arch to lean to the unsupported side, which might cause a slight torquing effect, putting stress on the arch's attachment points. I wanted to ensure an even distribution of support from side to side. So another option would be to create a loop that the emeralds could safely fit through. However, in order to ensure there was enough space for the emeralds to slip through, it would end up being much wider and would cover over a lot of the piercings, which are, I think, an important aspect of the crown. So the solution I came up with was to snake the arm around each of the emeralds, alternating sides with each curve. By going in and out, the load would be distributed evenly along the center balance point. Thus, there'd be no potential for torquing stress on the arches. And this is what it ended up looking like. Okay, with the emerald sections fairly well contoured and established, I was then able to continue forming the arms down and over the countless bumps and crevices of the interior of the crown. The fit really needed to be as exact as possible, since this was the thinnest and most visible part of the mount. As you can see here, the arms are so thin that, and when you're directly looking at the crown, you just see straight through it, so really had to be tight. My next obstacles were these nuts that attach the arches to the diadem. The nuts had been decoratively filed and were a point of visual interest, so I didn't want to cover over them with a bulky mount. However, they fell really low on the on the crown, so it was a point in the mount where I needed to maintain rigidity. So I needed to find a way to go around them, but also maintain enough brass for the mount to remain strong. So I decided to try a technique I'd never used before, which was to actually stretch a hole directly into the arm of the mount. When I started construction on the arms, I made sure to use a strap thicker and wider than I needed, so I'd be able to grind them down later to the exact taper I required. So I was confident I had enough brass there to form a hole around the nuts and still maintain the rigidity I needed. So here you can see, stretching a hole in the strap causes the length of the strap to stretch in both directions due to the displacement of the brass. And because the section of the arm above the nuts had already been formed, that position was already set. Therefore, I estimated that as the hole began to stretch and get larger, the center point of the circle would move slightly lower than where it had started. To compensate, I drilled a small 1/8-inch hole slightly above the middle of where the screw would be. Then as I stretched the hole, the center of the hole would end up in the center of the arm. To make the hole, I chucked a 1/4-inch brass rod into my drill and brought it to the sander, where I sanded it down to a taper. I then annealed the mount around the hole, and I hammered the tapered rod into the hole while bracing the mount over an opening in a steel block. I continued to hammer until I felt the brass had become work hardened and stopped before the brass began to crack, and then re-annealed it. And as you can see at this point, the tapered section of the rod was about halfway through, but the hammering had deformed the hole, and although it was wider, it was getting somewhat domed. To correct this, I flipped the mount over and hammered the taper of the rod the rest of the way through from the other side. And by the time I had passed the full tapered section through the hole, the domed section of the brass had been pushed back close to being flat again. And then I basically created the same kind of taper with a 1/2-inch brass rod and repeated the process until the hole was the diameter that I needed. I found that a couple of the arms had started drifting to an angle because I hadn't drilled the hole exactly perfectly in the center of the strap, which left a little bit more mass on one side than the other, which caused the one side with the least amount of mass to stretch more, and so it caused the angle to form. And to correct this, basically what I did was to hammer this side with the more metal, and it stretched it back out again and realigned the arm. Now that the holes in the arms had been created, the upper portion of the mount was complete, and I began construction on the bottom half of the arms, which had to be constructed in separate sections. Because the arms would be fed in from the top of the crown, they needed to be able to tilt into place with the crown sitting flat. This is kind of similar to the experience of trying to install shelves in a small closet. If you've ever tried to put a shelf into a closet where you can't slide it in horizontally from the front, you know that the shelf needs to be cut a little in order to be able to tilt into place. I anticipated that the four arms would have the same problem when I tried to angle them into the crown, and also the need to maneuver around the dangling jewels would create a space issue. Therefore, I estimated that I would need an extra 1/2 inch of room in order to install each arm without having to spring them in, which would have put an unsafe amount of pressure on the piece. In order to get the extra space I needed, I designed a hinge system. This hinge would allow the very bottom of the mount to swing out, reducing the length of the arm by about a 1/2 inch. This 1/2 inch would give me the extra room I needed to get the mount in position and around the emeralds and locked into place at the top. Once the arm was in the correct position, I could swing the hinged section back down, fix it in place with a screw, and attach the mount to the base plate. The hinge system also helped solve another issue. This crown was originally created for a polychrome statue of the Virgin Mary. Small gold eye hooks, that you can see here, they were used for tying the crown to the head of the sculpture. And unfortunately, these eye hooks were situated directly in the path of where my mount needed to go. And going around them would require making a wider mount, which would have covered over more of the piercings. So this meant that the part of the mount that needed to be the strongest and the most robust would need to either go up and around and over these eye hooks, which would have been a massive eyesore, or a cavity needed to be created in the arm to accommodate them. I decided that the cavity was the best solution. Oh, sorry about that. And was able to come up with a hinge design that also compensated for the removal of the brass. To create the hinge, I used a milling machine to mill out an 1/8-inch slot on either ends of each of the pieces. I used 1/8-inch flat stock to fill in the channel, which interlocks with the groove in the other side. I also used 1/8-inch flat stock to create a locking arm, and these two get soldered in place. The cavity is created for the eye hooks, and the two pieces are joined together. And then a hole was drilled through both of the arms, and the ends of the holes are countersunk, and a brass pivot pin is slid in. The countersink on either side creates room for the pin to expand as it's hammered on both sides. And when it's sanded flush, the pin still remains in place because the ends are flared out. And once it's all sanded, it creates a nearly invisible hinge pin. And then the locking arm gets screwed, drilled and tapped for a screw. And that locking arm immobilizes the hinge once that screw is in. The locking arm also helps support the thin area created by the cavity in the eye hook. This thin area here. The arm creates a 90-degree angle with the thinnest part of the cavity. This 90-degree angle is similar to an angle iron. The structure of an angle iron is significantly more rigid than the sum of the two planes of metal that create it. Once screwed together, the arm becomes really rigid and stable enough to support the long length of the arched arm above it, even though it contains a cavity for the eye hooks. With the top and bottom halves of the mount created, I brought both pieces of the arms into the crown and determined how they'd be formed and brazed together. And at this point, the arms were pretty much completed and could be screwed to the bottom plate. All that was left was toning out the brass to match the gold and felting the mount. And here you can see the mount. It's not fully completed at this point, but it's fairly well complete. But it's next to the crown. And here's the crown with the mount installed. And that's it. And it was an honor to get to work on such a challenging piece, and I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to share my process with you. Thank you very much.